Thank you for joining us for Buoyant City, Preservation, Resilience, and Tourism in Miami Beach. My name is Tina Brennan. I'm the Vice President of Marketing at Metropolis. This is the 6th year for Metropolis's Think Tank series, a thought leadership program that visits top firms in key markets in North America. This month, we're hosted by Miami firms. Today, we are very pleased to be hosted by Schulman and Associates, who will be exploring the idea of preservation as a powerful adaptive tool of historic buildings that need to be reconstructed due to the effects of climate change. In October, we will also be hosted by HKS, and then it's on to Houston in November. Upcoming Think Tank Thursday programming can be found on the registration page and will be continually updated. The registration URL will be put in chat for you. Today's panel is CEU accredited, both through AIA and IDCEC. If you did not request accreditation when you registered, please send an email to ceu@metropolismag.com. We will also place this URL in the chat room. Hosting an event like this requires the support of great firms like Schulman and Associates, as well as our amazing sponsors. We'd like to thank Durkin, a world-renowned industry leader in innovative design solutions and stylish high-performance hospitality carpeting and hard surface flooring. Grohe, designing and engineering innovative water products for bathroom solutions and kitchen fittings. Material Bank, the largest material marketplace for sampling in the architecture and interior design industry. Today's panel discussion will run approximately 1.5 hours, or until 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And now I'd like to introduce today's moderator, our editor-in-chief at Metropolis, Avi Rajagopal. Avi, take it away.
Thank you so much, Tina. And thanks everyone for joining us for today's discussion. I'm so excited about the topic we're going to discuss today because it is the result of a long study conducted for the city of Miami Beach by an amazing group of researchers, including 2 firms represented on the panel today, Schulman and Associates and D-Line Studio, and with input from the Department of Historic Preservation in the city of Miami Beach, who is also represented on the panel today. Miami Beach, was founded really as a leisure city in the 1900s. And, even though that initial reputation faded a little bit in the mid-century, then in the 1970s, the city saw an amazing historic preservation movement that really turned the city of Miami Beach, which is essentially a barrier island, into a hospitality destination for people not only from around the United States, but from around the world. Today, of course, those historic districts are facing an existential threat from climate change, as well as, from various climate events. Regular king tides, for instance, in the area of Miami Beach. So the question is, how will we preserve the fabric of cities like Miami Beach, which have evolved, out of really particular historic circumstances in the face of climate change? How can we keep those communities thriving? How can we keep those economies going? And how can we support those communities and those people as they go through some challenging periods, certainly in the next few years, especially with regards to sea level rise and climate change. We have an amazing group of panelists, and as I said, a group that's put together a study, Buoyant City, which is being presented for approval to the city of Miami Beach this month. And so you're getting some advanced insights from what is bound to be a really influential study for the city. We have with us discussing that today, Alan Schulman, who's the founding principal at Schulman Associates, and also a professor and director of graduate programs in architecture at the University of Miami. We have with us Susanna Drake, who is an associate professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, and of course also the founding principal of D-Line Studio, and Deborah Tackett, who is the chief of historic preservation at the city of Miami Beach. Thank you all so much for joining me today. Alan,
Thank you for having us.
of course. I'd love to have you kick us off, Alan. Not everybody in our audience is going to be familiar with the very particular problem you face in Miami Beach. Can you distill for us what is that crisis that the city faces, and out of the guidelines that you've developed, why have you chosen the strategy of adapt in place as particularly suited for the historic districts in Miami Beach?
So thank you, Avi. Well, Miami Beach is a pretty singular city, but it has many things that connect it to other cities along the East Coast especially. It's a city built on a barrier island. It was built by dredging and filling. And so one of the characteristics of the city is that it presents itself today as a series of islands surrounded by water on all sides. But not only is it surrounded by water on all sides, but the water is coming from underneath. The water sort of seeps in into the foundations of the city. And so the usual options that you might have of trying to dike or to to sort of wall off the city to water really isn't available to Miami or to Miami Beach. So so it seems like the city and its buildings are going to have to adapt on their own from a building by building standpoint. One of the things about Miami Beach that's really interesting is it's a thriving city. I mean, it's urban, it's dense. It's a lot of multifamily buildings and commercial buildings, so it's not the same condition, for instance, that you would find in a city of homes, which would be much more easily raisable. And so we began to sort of cast around for other ways of thinking about adapting the city. One of the ways that we hit on really builds on a tradition in Miami Beach. As a thriving city, the city has reinvented itself many times. It was founded as a leisure city. It became a city of apartment buildings and hotels. It's changed stylistically and demographically so many times, and economically it's also reinvented itself. So we thought, perhaps there's a way that the buildings could grow out of their circumstance, could adapt in their current position to all the things that are happening. And when we talk about resilience, I think it goes beyond water. It's a lot of things, including today COVID-19 and other economic and social conditions. So now on top of all that, it's a series of historic districts, in fact. And these historic districts have hundreds of buildings in them. So, what's really significant, I think one of the most significant things about these historic districts is how all the buildings work with each other. So again, I think that idea of incremental growth, of layering new things on top of old things, which again have a long history in Miami Beach, seemed like a viable way forward for the city.
Right. I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about that layering strategy in just a few minutes, but thank you so much for laying that out for us. First of all, as you said, the problems that Miami Beach faces are problems that are faced by cities on all over the Eastern Seaboard. If we think that we can build a wall to keep the storms out and to keep the rising sea level out, that is just not going to be a solution that fits all places. The particular problem of Miami's, of Miami's aquifer, Miami Beach's soil, those things make things really complicated in Miami Beach. I also, I think, want to emphasize to everybody who's listening, that we need the series of perspectives on existing building stock, especially on on buildings of historic value, which have primarily been considered up to now, on the basis of their energy performance. When we talk about sustainability, when we talk about carbon neutral by 2030 and so on, but there's this whole layer of climate resilience that has to be built into historic districts and historic buildings that has certainly not received, I think, the attention that it needs to. So thank you so much, Alan, for laying out the problems of doing that, and also for pointing out a strategy that, as you said, has history in the city of Miami. I just want to remind everyone in the audience, I'm seeing some comments already coming in. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to get us questions at any point of time and during this discussion. We're going to take your questions in just a few minutes. Susanna, I'd like to come to you. First of all, congratulations on your National Design Award for Climate Action.
Thank you.
Which you received last week. Thank you so much for all the work that you do. You know, as a citizen of New York, your work at the Sponge Park is incredible. What role do you see landscape architecture playing in this scheme that that you've laid out within Buoyant City, in Miami Beach, and elsewhere? You know, in safeguarding the future of those cities. So, what role does landscape play in dealing with climate, but also in preserving the life of cities?
Well, you know, it's interesting that Alan raised the notion or the fact that that Miami Beach sits on a barrier island, because barrier islands were in geomorphological, or from a geomorphological perspective, dynamic elements in the landscape. Now, if we're thinking in geologic time, and you know, they form barriers for the inland places, but they also weren't necessarily these big walls of land, or they would move and change and depending on the climate or even weather and tides and a lot of the dynamic forces of the environment. But you know, architecture and engineering don't tend to want to move. And we have built this city on a bedrock that is actually somewhat like a sponge. It's built out of, or the geology is limestone. So it's porous. And Alan referred to that before, that the water is coming up from below. So, you know, that's a challenging set of engineering criteria for facing sea level rise. And so our thought is, okay, you know, let's look back to the way the natural systems work and think about how we can use the power of those natural systems to augment the engineering and the architectural systems to make a more sustainable environment. So, and what we want to do is use nature-based strategies to kind of strengthen the future landscape. But I think we're also trying to capture time. So with a building or with an engineered system, you build it and it's as strong as it's ever going to be the first day you build it. But with a landscape, you might build something that gains strength over time because the roots will get more settled, or the canopy will grow and it'll give you more shade. You know, landscapes can become more resilient over time if they're designed properly. So we're trying to capture that. Now, how do you do that when the water level is rising and when, you know, you're getting flooding and you're getting saltwater intrusion? Well, you know, we've thought about that with buildings. Okay, we might have to raise the buildings, as challenging as that can be from an engineering perspective. But we also need to think about raising the landscape. Now, you don't want to plant a tree at this level and then, you know, have to move it because it's probably going to die. So why not plant the trees at this level? You know, plant them high and, you know, capture that growth. So that's a little bit in the weeds about what we're doing, but it sort of speaks to the idea that we need to anticipate a future condition with a landscape that we're building now. So those are some of the things that we've been thinking about. And I think just to add, you know, we talk about the kind of the ecology of the area, and I think part of that ecology needs to include the human ecology and the human connection to this landscape, because that's really what is linking the landscape strategies and the architectural strategies and the historic preservation strategies.
Right. Thank you for laying out, first of all, the very basic differences in approach between landscape architecture and architecture and engineering. You know, obviously, the way those designs change over time, as you said, is very different, and that's such a key part of the strategy. Thank you also for actually going into some of that detail. I think that's really important for us to hear in terms of just getting a sense of how you're thinking about the process by which the city might be able to stand up to the challenges it faces over the next 60 years or so. Deborah, I'd love to bring you in on this. You know, in Miami Beach, as in many other cities with really important historic areas, those historic areas are really engines of growth, and they're very essential to the communities in that city, to their survival, to their livelihood, and so on. Also to their sense of belonging, of course, to the place. Do you think it's possible for us to preserve that legacy while also sort of adapting to the future? I mean, how does this sort of layering strategy that Alan was talking about, how are you thinking about that with your sort of historical preservation cap on?
That's a great question. And you know, I'm very lucky to work for such a dynamic city. The legacy of Miami Beach. So when you really start to study the architectural legacy of Miami Beach, you know, it becomes very obvious that Miami Beach has always been this reinvention. It's always been embracing really evolution and reinvention. Most of that was really just in response to economic, social, and cultural changes. If you look at Miami Beach in the 1920s, for example, when it was really first starting to develop, you know, this city, even on the ocean front, primarily had these extremely lavish single-family homes that were winter retreats for wealthy Midwesterners and Northerners. And then you look at the Great Depression. That's when primarily during the Depression years in the 1930s is when the vast majority of our Art Deco and streamlined buildings were built and were designed and built. That is what we're known for, right? When people who aren't as familiar with Miami Beach around the world think of the city, they think of the identity as Art Deco. It drives me crazy a little bit because sometimes people think everything here is Art Deco, when in fact, if you look at what happened during World War II, when the city was a major training ground for the Army and Air Force forces of World War II, and immediately following World War II, the amount of, the architecture that was built, the amount of housing that was needed, created a second layer of identity, right? The Art Deco and streamlined structures were retained, and yet we made room for new innovative architecture that reflected its time. And that has occurred throughout the city's life. We've reinvented ourselves. What you were speaking about earlier about the 1970s, when the appreciation of the Depression era architecture really started a buzz. It started a buzz, and then by the 80s and into the 90s with Miami Vice and with the Gianni Versace moving to Ocean Drive, that was a whole different identity, right? All of a sudden we were in every magazine you picked up, every TV show or movie. We were really being celebrated as this amazing dynamic place. So when we look at now, kind of being forced to grapple with this changing again, basically as a force of nature, I think learning about the history really takes some of the anxiety out that a lot of people feel when you talk about changing a historic district. So I think every city, every community that has to try to adapt to save their historic fabric is going to have different issues. In Miami Beach, I think we have an advantage because we've always been forward thinking. We've always understood that we're not frozen in time. We're not a museum city. So, when Alan approached this project, he worked closely with the city, and that was the philosophy, that we are going to preserve what we have, what's important to our residents and our culture, and make room for the future. And I'm really excited about it. I think we're gonna, have a lot of fascinating projects coming up in the next 10 years.
Awesome. I do feel less anxious. I think, once we understand that, change is part of the fabric of cities, and especially a dynamic city like Miami Beach, I think it just it just increases our openness to, you know, the big changes we're going to have to make. You know, it's on our generation really at this point to kind of preserve and ensure the life of these cities. So thank you so much for that. I just want to remind everyone, sorry, that Q&A season is open. So if you want to, you know, get your questions in there into our Q&A button, that would be great. We have a couple of questions, but before we get to those, I would just love to talk a little bit more about the adapt in place or the adaptive response to resiliency. I think both Alan and Susanna, you spoke about, you know, there are options. You know, you could raise buildings. There are other things you could be doing, building barriers. You know, many cities have explored those. New York is currently, you know, in the process of working through its own resiliency, you know, guidelines. So, you know, there's a variety of tactics available. I would just love to kind of, if we can outline really what an adaptive strategy involves that maybe, you know, other strategies may not. And Alan, if you could start us off, and then I'd love to have Susanna and Deborah come into that, and then we'll start taking audience questions.
Yeah, sure. So, well, you know, it was interesting when Susanna was speaking about how plants grow and change over time. And I think it's true that buildings are more solid and they're more permanent, but buildings also grow and change over time. And so one of the interesting ways, so we looked at three ways, for instance, three main strategies that could be used to adapt in place. And one of them, which is actually demonstrated in some of the FEMA literature out there, is to raise floors within buildings, but leave the buildings on the ground, leave the buildings where they are and sort of raise everything within. This, you know, this results in some sort of unusual arrangements in the building, but of course it preserves the character of the overall building, right? Of the overall presentation of the building on the street, its relationship to its neighbors, its relationship to the ground and to the landscape around it. And I think it could be made interesting as a strategy. And then another one that I think, you know, of course, it could be somewhat controversial, but one sort of way that FEMA looks at buildings is residential, non-residential. And if it's a non-residential use, we're allowed to dry or wet floodproof it, which means dry floodproofing really means sort of keeping the water out, building almost like a tub to keep waters out. And wet floodproofing basically allows water to go through. So we kind of open the building up. There are vents that allow water to come in if the water is rising so that it doesn't compromise the structure of the building. If we do that, we could imagine that some of these residential buildings would have their ground floors converted into other uses. It could be anything from the work portion of live work to amenities for the building, to bicycle storage, to small retail or commercial uses. I mean, not certainly nothing so bold as a Starbucks, let's say, but it could be or let's say crowded, but it could be, for instance, an architect's office or a law office or something like that, right? So I think that, and there are examples of all of these kind of transformations already happening throughout the beach, generally in more high density sort of beachfront areas, more sort of resort areas. The third strategy that we looked at, which we call the reverse matryoshka, which is basically building a building within the building, sort of allowing the building to disengage from the shell somewhat in order to resolve some of the issues that come up with, let's say, new floor levels relating to historic windows and that sort of thing. And I think that's a strategy that is not currently very promoted under the current preservation system that we have. You know, the Secretary of Interior Standards, you know, would argue against that. But I think it's used in many other places. It's used in many cities in Europe, and I think it could be a strategy that could work here. One of the things we found with these adaptive strategies is that often they come up against preservation practice, preservation standards. And those standards are pretty regularized in the US right now. I mean, they come down from the preservation law, federal preservation law, and Secretary of Interior standards. And there are certain ways of doing things. For instance, keeping any additions out of the line of sight. And, you know, we acknowledge that in this sort of way of thinking about the beach, this resilience layer that we were hoping to add, think it would be appropriate in Miami Beach that we may have to think about things, and we may have to challenge some of those standards and rules and think about things in a slightly different way now.
Right. Yeah. If somebody doesn't bring up the question of, you know, code and regulation and the flexibility that we need on that, I'll certainly bring it up later. So let's pick up on that a little later. I'd love to get Susanna in a little bit on this idea of adaptation. We do have a few audience questions up now, but Susanna, can you talk about how landscapes can adapt and grow in the way that Alan is talking about? What are the strategies sort of available there?
Well, one of the things that I think people don't often talk about is that you know, landscape and infrastructure are intertwined. And right, so in Miami or in Miami Beach, the city was raising the roads so that the fire trucks and the police cars can get through for emergencies, right? And someone asked, Alan Swerdlow was asking about, like, what are you doing about raising or about this water that is coming in already on a regular basis? Well, the city is raising the roads. So that's fine. And incrementally, you know, raising works for a while. But at some point you get to a stage where your road is up here and your house is down here. And you have to be able to get your car from here to there. And so that can make it so you can't get into your garage, you know, because of the slopes. And then you have the problem of, okay, if you start raising the buildings also to match the roads, you know, what's happening with the landscape in between? So how are you reconciling that grade? And then, you know, what happens to the trees that, you know, happen to have been growing that are huge and beautiful? Like, what do you do about that? So, you know, there are a lot of things that we need to take into account that, you know, many of which are logistical in terms of how the city is operating, many of which are kind of intrinsic to its beauty, you know, these giant trees, this verdant landscape, and even the organization of the way people use their yards, you know, all of that is factored in. But then, you know, the kind of what is the future? You know, how do you recreate that? And I mean, one of the great things about working in Miami is that it's a subtropical environment, or it's, you know, it's very warm, and things grow. So things grow fast. So that's great. You know, it's not like planting in a desert. You know, it's like there's lots of water and the trees and there's lots of sun. And so the plants can grow and the landscapes can thrive if you give them the right environment. But again, you have to anticipate that future environment. So that's kind of what we're trying to do in the plan in relation to these three strategies that Alan just outlined. So, and they, you know, they get tweaked a little bit differently based on these strategies. And, you know, one of them in particular, the one where you're sort of building another building inside, it creates opportunities for these kind of really interesting spaces, landscape spaces that are inside and outside. And then in a place like Miami Beach, you know, that's an ideal condition, right? You want to be outside, but you want to be in the shade, you want to be protected. You know, it's kind of a wonderful new typology to explore.
The one thing I think all of you make me really hopeful for, you know, that some of the things that seem to us, you know, really burdensome and scary can be great creative opportunities. Stephen Kohler has our first question here, and I think, Deborah, you might be the best one to tackle it right off the bat, and then we'll see if Alan and Susanna want to weigh in too. Stephen says, how do the panelists anticipate issues of historic preservations interacting with housing affordability and increasing flood risk in the next decade or two? Thank you. So obviously, you know, historic districts are also residential districts. How are we looking at housing affordability? How are we looking at the longevity of those communities?
Absolutely. So, that's a complex question, and that's a question that the city has actually been discussing for quite some time. Um, for instance, the Flamingo Park neighborhood, which is part of the study area of the guidelines, that there is a lot of reasonably affordable housing, more of a workforce housing. Typically, the units are smaller units. And there is an existing stock of workforce type housing that's available. Now, the guidelines will require an investment from the property owner. And I know there's always a concern, will that displace some of these more affordable housing? And it has the potential to, but it has the potential also to do the opposite in terms of incentivizing resiliency. So if the property owners do nothing, there's a cost for that. And there's a cost to the property owner in terms of the insurance, which it's a problem now, and it's going to be even a bigger problem in the next 5 to 10 years. So I think with the incentives, in order to encourage someone to create a more resilient residential building, for example, there may be opportunities for the city to consider policies that would actually allow for additional units or smaller units if the project met certain criteria. These are policy questions. These are questions that the city has been working with in other areas with new construction. There have been incentives in place for example, for additional height. And you are allowed to create smaller units. Co-living, for example, is kind of a new concept that the city has really embraced in certain areas where it makes sense. And the idea there is those units will be more affordable. It's critical in terms of our resilience to have, workforce be able to live on Miami Beach because of our transportation networks. And because we are so dependent on our hospitality industry, our hotel workers, restaurant workers, as well as, we have amazing schools in Miami Beach. We have an amazing hospital in Miami Beach. So that is definitely something that is part of this larger conversation. And the city really does understand how critical that is to our resilience. So it'll be interesting to see, these concepts, which they're really, developed concepts that are in these guidelines. If they start moving forward, those types of details, I think, will be essential for the city's resilience.
Right, absolutely. Alan or Susanna, did you want to say something about that, about affordability playing into your guidelines?
Just add that, what Debbie said is right. I mean, in one of Miami Beach's, or in several of Miami Beach's many lives, or the many lives of these neighborhoods, they were a reservoir of affordable housing. And, they still perform that way. And it would be a real shame culturally, and I think one of the arguments of preserving the city is a cultural argument and a social argument, right? It's not just architectural or urban. It has to do with the life of the people who are there. So one of the arguments is, that we need to be more proactive. And as Debbie mentioned, one of the things that seemed important to bring into the mix here was some incentives that allow the city to steer a little bit the growth of these adaptive responses in positive directions, and one of them has to be maintaining social housing. So I think the city, nobody knows exactly what that'll look like at the moment, but I mean, certainly allowing smaller unit sizes is a big one. Right now, Miami Beach has a housing size standard that's probably 30 years old, that dates from the time that the city was trying to bring in let's say some higher level developers, but now the city is filling up with those larger apartments. And I think we could begin to look at micro units, at places that are more open to people moving in and out more quickly, sort of transient lodging, as well.
This is
dog.
yeah. Welcome to my life. My dog is excited.
I love it. I have a comment on that if there's time.
Go ahead, Susanna.
Well, I was just thinking about the Industrial Revolution. Sorry, like my brain's going off into not quite a tangent, but I was thinking about the social reformers of the early or of the late 19th century and early 20th century, and how they influenced landscape architecture. So in the design of sanitary engineering systems for cities, in the design of new open space, and really adding public open space that was available to all. So about equity. And I feel like we're in a new phase. We're feeling the ramifications of the Industrial Revolution, 100 years later, or 100 years later. And we have a new idea for ecological reform. Like, I'd like to think of myself as an ecological reformer, right? So that now, along with following some of the strategies of my predecessors, I'm thinking about open space for everybody, and trying to increase, maybe not sanitation, or sanitation in addition to climate resilience and adaptability, but also wrapping in infrastructure and sort of re-engaging landscape architecture with the design of infrastructure systems, which I think the disconnect happened during the sort of war years, and I think we need to have a reconnect. And so my ecological reform would be that reconnection.
Right, absolutely. How can we, create both public space as well as public infrastructure, and kind of, align them towards those twin goals of both equity and, resilience or sustainability? I think that's a beautiful idea. Thank you so much for that, Susanna. Adele says, the New York Times recently posted an article regarding the wildfires in California, where officials are now turning to Native Americans for help, having a long history of controlled burns for land management. How might Miami connect with indigenous communities to learn previous flood control and drainage techniques? Is there any sort of connection to indigenous communities in the area? Is that connection? I know Miami Beach is not a very old urban settlement, certainly, but Alan, do you want to comment?
It's Miami does not seem like an old settlement, but in fact, it's ancient. There were Native Americans on the shores of the Miami River thousands of years ago, and already building settlements there. So, as archaeological evidence has proven, there's a building type that comes from that tradition, which is raised. It's called the Chiki hut, which is basically on stilts. It's a lightweight wood structure built on stilts that allows the air to flow underneath, allows the house to stay dry. So I think that's a great model for new structures, new houses in particular, even new larger buildings. At the University of Miami, there's a new multi-hundred unit housing structure that's been finished. It's all raised on pilotis with parks and gardens underneath. So I think that's a great strategy, but it would be hard to implement in a historic district, let's say, with defined by buildings that really do sit on the grounds with masonry walls and more or less heavy structures.
Maybe thinking about sort of ideas of use could start to flavor the conversation. Again, it's a little tough in a historic district, but in terms of the landscape, I think about how native settlements would be in a location because of the value of being in that place, and that occupation of that place might vary based on the time of year. We have people going down to Miami in the winter from cold places because it's nice there. It's like there's some similar patterns. We're human and we like to be in certain places because the environment is better than where we came from. But I think the idea of migration, away from a place and then back to a place based on some of the fluctuations of the weather or the climate may need to happen more often. I think it already happens. When we had our discussions, there were some talk about like what you do during a hurricane, for instance.
That goes back to the history of Miami too, because it was a seasonal city.
Right. We were talking, I think Deborah mentioned it and Alan mentioned it too, that, it's important to have people living and working in the city of Miami Beach, just because of, I think Deborah, you said it, because of the transit network in the area and so on. And so that clearly means, it's linked to affordability. It's linked to having a diversity of communities in the area. Yang Bodu asks, how might we ensure we avoid climate apartheid or the well-off using adaptation as a way to avoid facing the consequences of high carbon emissions? And he links to an article about climate resilience and essentially wealthy communities kind of retreating, and leaving behind, climate impacted most climate impacted areas to affordable real estate. I wonder if there's a thought on that. I mean, it's a really complex topic. I understand it's much bigger than anything we might be able to tackle in this conversation. But if somebody wants to offer a thought or two on that, that would be great. Go ahead, Alan.
Jesse Keenan at Harvard has written about climate gentrification, and certainly there's a lot of arguments to be made that is already happening in Miami. But Miami Beach is a bit the other way around. It's right in the path of the water and right in the path, and yet it's. I think this is about trying to set up the ground for its survival in place, for not abandoning the city. I think it would be a real shame to think about leaving these coastal communities, especially a coastal community with the history and livelihood of Miami Beach. It's a city that functions the way cities should, in a way. It's walkable. It's mixed uses. It's got everything really, and so I think that is happening. I think it's just to turn that around a bit. It ties back to the affordable housing question. It's how do you maintain the conditions to have mixed, cost living arrangements, in the city after all of this investment is required to bring it to adapt it, right?
If I could, what I think is really an interesting case study in Miami Beach is that about 10 years ago, it was actually the city. So the city initiated in a very bold move and did it very quickly, the infrastructure process. So what we've seen is a local government, actually take action first, not in response to, you see private development doing that. In the case of Miami Beach, the local government took swift action in a very bold move that received a good amount of criticism, and started, keeping our streets dry. We also worked with private property owners, and we continue to, for existing buildings at existing, structural conditions, existing finished floor levels, to try to harmonize their water management with the new elevated streets. And for me, I think this is such a unique, and to be perfectly honest with you, someone who's worked in government for so long, shocking turn of events. Yeah. You typically see government acting very slow and trying to play catch up to what you would see as private development or private homeowners that are just trying to, keep the water out of their particular property. So I think the city's investment really says a lot. And we still haven't seen a large amount of our development community try to follow suit. The city has to really push developers or homeowners to take responsibility for their own property. I think they kind of saw what we did in terms of the roadway network and the landscape initiatives that we have throughout the city. And it's really been kind of the opposite of the way you would think it would be in terms of government taking the lead. Now, again, we were criticized. We didn't do it perfectly. But I think that the real incredible aspect of all of that was, even though mistakes were made, once the horse is out of the barn, the city is going to keep going in that direction, right? And so that, to me, I think is just mind-boggling that we were able to pull that off. Now we're looking at things in a different lens, but we're still moving forward. So I just think that's really fascinating.
Absolutely fantastic. Just a quick reminder to everyone, we're here talking about Buoyant City, Preservation, Resiliency, and Tourism in Miami Beach with Deborah Tackett from the City of Miami Beach, Susanna Drake from D-Line Studio, and Alan Schulman from Schulman & Associates, who are also a host for today's program. I want to take this moment to just thank our sponsors again, Durkin, Grohe, as well as Material Bank for making today's program possible. We've set up quite a storm in the Q&A window. I feel like there's a lot of back and forth going on. Lots of passionate Miami Beach and Miami residents here discussing, various measures. Before we jump into that, Fray, though, I just want to talk about one thing that we haven't really addressed separately, and I'd love to, is while we've talked a lot about residential development and, about homeowners and things like that, Miami Beach is its economy was built, on the backs of the hospitality industry. And so I'd love to just talk about, are there any specific considerations or challenges or opportunities to do with, hotel properties? I know, Alan, the Buoyant City guidelines do have special recommendations for those. So if you'd like to just talk a little bit about that, maybe Deborah wants to comment on that as well, before we jump into some of the other things that we have in the Q&A tab.
Well, the hotel buildings are largely bigger buildings, most of them, and more complex also in terms of their uses. So they're really important also to keep within the mix of Miami Beach. So the guidelines as they apply to hotel buildings are very similar to residential buildings in the way that we sort of recommend dealing with form and structure and but I think it's important to note that Miami Beach isn't really, the tourists that come to Miami Beach come for the city and come for the general ambiance of everything, perhaps for the historic buildings, the historic districts, for the life of the city. So I think it's important that as we start talking about resiliency and start acting on resiliency, that we begin to make resiliency part of the narrative of the city, like that it's part of the story of Miami Beach. And Miami Beach has all these layered stories. It's everything from, leisure city to retirement community to, the places where Europeans flocked to in the early 80s. And I think this is going to be the next story, is a city that is adapting itself, sort of complex waterfront city. And so I think somehow hotels and also the city itself need to start bringing that into the overall identity mix of the city, making it more prominent, as not trying to hide it in a way or make it something subterranean, but something really prominent that Miami Beach is doing differently.
Yeah, to that point, I think that's really important. And it goes back to what I was talking about the city's early, kind of just bold, quick action. Miami Beach, if we're known for one thing, it's beauty, our natural beauty, our architectural beauty, the beautiful people that live here and visit here. And I think it is an opportunity to look at resiliency, look at engineering as as an opportunity for beautiful design. We have been consistently, in terms of the quality of our architecture, whether it's Mediterranean Revival, Art Deco, or contemporary architecture, we have always pushed for the highest quality beautiful design. And I think there's a wonderful opportunity to do that with infrastructure and with resiliency initiatives that would actually potentially draw more tourism. just for that, because we are really on the forefront. In terms of resiliency strategies for historic communities, there's really mostly you see guidelines out for raising buildings. I think this is really the first comprehensive study that I've seen that really looks at it from all angles and has other options other than just keep everything the same and lift it up 4 feet. So I think it's an amazing opportunity to continue that evolution of design and the quality of design.
Right. We have a question here from Anne McHugh. She says, any thoughts on the newly installed inflatable flood barriers installed in Venice, or how Rotterdam has managed sea level rise and what Miami can learn from these cities? While resiliency shifts cannot be expected to come from the free market, Boston has some new development requirements that building sites work with each other to create a resilient barrier for larger weather events to protect the neighborhoods behind them. So just maybe we can broaden that question to just talk about, during the study, as all of you have been, going through this exercise, Susanna, for instance, you are involved in resiliency measures in other cities around the country. What are we learning from other countries, other cities? What is applicable, what is not? I'd just love to reflect on that just a little bit.
Well, I want to go back to the geology.
Okay.
Because the geology of a place is really important. We've done work in New Orleans, and I think some of the strategies that are suggested here or were suggested by Anne, can relate to places like New Orleans. And we've come up with a lot of different strategies that are specific to that place. It has to do with the soils and the way the water's moving. In that case, it's a lot of fresh water moving through the system. In this case, we have I've done a lot of work in New York City, and there are particular conditions there that I work with, always thinking about the dynamic relationship between freshwater and saltwater. And that's particularly important in these coastal environments when you're starting to introduce any kind of planted community, because the ecosystem really can shift a great deal based on the level of salinity. But the unique sort of base that we have here, again, is that limestone. And that's a really tricky thing to work with. And we don't necessarily have the answers, but I don't think you can just apply something from another geomorphological situation to Miami because of this really unique condition. And so, we're trying to adapt, and we're trying to sort of think about sort of a time horizon for 50 years. But, I don't know if in 500 years, if this will be the solution. The Dutch can plan for the 10,000-year flood. A lot of the country is already below sea level, so they have to, but they also have a geologic condition where they can do that. I don't know if we have that here. I don't, so we're using our best technology as architects and preservationists and engineers and landscape architects to adapt. But I think there will need to be kind of new inventions or new strategies for urban development that have yet to sort of evolve. Not to be all gloom and doom, but
I just
it's
add
different
that
here.
the part that I liked about that question was about the project in Boston was the idea of working together with neighbors. And I don't think we'd be able to work together with neighbors here to build a barrier for the reasons that Susanna mentions. But it's still really important to think about the neighborhood as a whole and the community as a whole, and that anything that one person does has the effect, it could have an effect on their neighbors, right? If you raise your property, for instance, you're actually also channeling more water around you that could have an effect on your neighbors. If you're, depending on what you plant, I suppose, that could also have an effect on how much water is standing or being absorbed into the area around you. So I think that idea of maybe having to develop new paradigms of working together. We're not used to doing that. Architects and developers and property owners, usually work on a project by project basis. But I think that would be really interesting and important to bring into the mix.
I have a quick addition to that. When we did the fourth regional plan, I worked with Rafi Siegel from MIT on the fourth regional plan, and we were looking at coastal communities. We looked at adapting or actually relocating people by neighborhood. So, but it was the same kind of community strategy. Like you have a really strong community, create an adaptation that works for that whole community. So.
Ed Yorka asks, how do you control flooding when we are continuously paving over pervious natural environment to accommodate the needs of population growth and associated financial growth? Is density, is growing population density an issue at all in Miami Beach? How are we, it is already, a pretty dense urban environment, a walkable environment, as you said, Alan, a lot of multifamily housing. How do we preserve some of those areas of natural landscape or sort of unpaved land within Miami Beach? Is that a consideration? Is that a value at all?
Yeah, I think there's not a lot of unpaved, let's say, open land except in parks and yards, but there are a lot of yards and there are great parks in Miami Beach. And so I think the question is actually to go further than that. Like yards and parks need to be redeveloped to be more green, to take out a lot of the pavements that is in them. But I think paved areas need to be reduced, right? We need to narrow roads down. Roads in Miami Beach are really wide. They don't need to be that wide. The sidewalks are narrow. Everything is non-pervious. Alleys, are non-pervious. So I think we could actually imagine going back through all of this infrastructure. And as Debbie is saying, the city is in the midst of renewing all this infrastructure right now. So you could imagine going through many of the decisions that are being made and saying, okay, we're going to reduce the width of the road. And that was part of the plan, and something that Susanna introduced is the idea of reducing, not just reducing the road width, but actually inserting buffers, landscape buffers along the roadways that would help negotiate the difference between road raising and yards, being maintained at their current level.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Somehow, yeah.
So
I think, yeah, I think there is a lot of pavement in Miami Beach, and certainly we can reduce a lot of that. So I think we have to go even past the public areas that we that we consider green right now. Although those are really important, and there's one in the middle of our study area, which is Flamingo Park, which is a relatively large park with lots of uses in it: tennis courts, basketball courts. It's pool. It has many functions, but one of those functions could also be to serve as a kind of buffer, green buffer, as an absorptive element in the overall hydrology of this new condition that we're moving into.
Right.
Susanna, I want to add one thing to that. So you have to kind of look at the city and try to mine the places where these kinds of strategies can happen. So we looked at the mobility of the cars, and we looked at how roads were wide, but we also looked at that there were two-way everywhere. So we ended up sort of changing the vehicular circulation in order to capture that space. So that's a pretty, it can be thought of as a minor change or a major change, because if you're used to driving in a particular way, to get to your house, you might feel the discomfort for a little while, but then ultimately you'll feel a comfort because you have all these new trees and because it's beautiful, right? So, but it's that kind of logistical, operational thinking that can help you find opportunities.
Right. Adam Grohe has brought in a new perspective into the conversation, and I'd love to get your response to that. He says, Debbie, can you talk about how the city's strategy of raising streets, because we were just talking about raising streets and the conditions it can create, is or isn't bringing challenges in terms of the accessibility of the city? Have there been significant problems with the barrier-free nature of the public realm when it butts up against the city's transition to higher ground? So, are we thinking about, accessibility,
Absolutely.
Yes, totally.
challenges?
That's a great question. And if you're familiar with Miami Beach, the first kind of experimental area where we really went fast is the Sunset Harbor neighborhood. And you see where those transitions are occurring. The answer is yes. We are very cognizant of accessible right-of-ways and not blocking, not raising the road so it blocks entry into your home, accessible entrance, ramps. One of the things we learned from that, however, is that even though, yes, it meets the requirements of accessibility, and that is something, we will always put as a priority, maybe it's not the most beautiful solution to accessibility. And I think that's where we really started to, kind of take a second look at certain things we did. And the amazing thing, again, is that it was done. So sometimes it's a lot easier for you to see the areas for improvement once it's built. That's not always the advice I give to people coming in asking me what they can do with their property, but in this particular instance, it's helpful. Things like railings, things like ramps, how they interact with the landscape. Those are very important things. We spend a lot of time with harmonization, as what the term is, harmonizing private property with the city infrastructure. More and more with every project that we do, it becomes more of a priority. I spent the last year looking at Indian Creek, which is another part of the study area. And there were things done with little input from other agencies. And so we kind of slowed that process down and started looking at each individual building, working with the property owners, doing a significant amount of outreach with each property owner to try to address their needs, the city's needs, and make it just generally look better, look more consistent with the character of the neighborhood. So, I think it's going to be a work in progress. I think someone had mentioned that, technology changes and things evolve over time. And I don't think what we do today will necessarily be exactly the same thing we do in 10 years because the new technologies will likely exist. But I think, just doing nothing would not be the option. Doing nothing and waiting for the perfect solution would be much more detrimental to the city, our property values, our residents' quality of life, than doing things and then correcting as we need to.
Right. I really appreciate that sort of incremental approach. You've already said, Deborah, it's really important for cities to take that first step, to like really push forward and then, start to, work through some of the challenges that creates. I mean, we're talking about a long-term process here, not a, a one-shot kind of solution. We have a lot of questions here that are related to just the architectural quality of Miami Beach, not so much resiliency. I'll just pick up one of them so that, we kind of talk about that. Alan, maybe you want to respond to this. Susan Kramer says, it's so great to have a balance between historic and new architecture. Any thoughts about the height restrictions and recently approved Raleigh site expansion and the Versailles Kangukuma project in terms of scale, context, et cetera? The harmonization that Deborah's talking about. And then further down, we had a question about, why Brickell has been so successful architecturally, as an insertion into the city of Miami. And then, of course, we have some, contradiction to that as well. Somebody thinks it's not a great addition. So I just want to let's just generalize that a little bit. Let's talk about sort of, how do we create that harmonization? Deborah's already laid out, it's the city's aim to kind of, build a a beautiful, comfortable, accessible built environment, that takes into account many different styles of architecture and kind of, and then harmonizes it with resiliency measures. Sorry, I love that word. I feel like all that we should be doing is harmonizing. Alan, can you talk about just, how do you build contextually in the context of Miami Beach?
Yeah, I mean, and it's especially difficult because Miami Beach has had so much change over the years, right? It's not, if we think about, what Debbie said, the way it began, in fact, this whole area, or the area up along Collins, which was large winter homes, and now they're hotels, and the hotels are being replaced by bigger hotels or by bigger apartment buildings. There has been that history of constant growth and pushing the boundaries, pushing the density in Miami Beach. It's been that way for like many years. So I can't speak specifically about the issue of the Raleigh Hotel, but I would say that, it is really important when working in Miami Beach, I think, to acknowledge that there are many different interests that play there. That it is a community, so people are living there and they're enjoying it, and and tourists also are coming for the character of the place and the quality of the place and quality of the architecture. And then there's also a development community in the city, which is very vibrant, always has been very dynamic. And so, constantly renewing. And some of the things, I will say some of the things we like today are things that we hated maybe 20 years ago or 30 years ago. But I think it's important that buildings that we do keep our eye on the contextual picture going forward. I realize that's not a hard answer to a question that is hitting a very current issue, but I think you have to negotiate those differences in height and in density and in the way buildings integrate into their surroundings.
Absolutely. I think everybody should just be thankful that I'm not like super well-versed in the architectural politics of Miami Beach. Otherwise, we might have had a much thornier conversation here. At least going by the emotional level of some of the comments here in the Q&A tab. I think, and a comment just came in from Natasha Aurora, providing our link from the Financial Times from 2013, saying that the essential problem is Miami's transient soul. Few Miamians feel a stake in its distant future. I feel like, though, given the warmth of some of the comments here in the Q&A, I really question that. Is there really a sense of that Miami Beach or Miami is sort of like an escape town for people, and that there isn't, that the people who might have leverage are people who don't have long-term roots in the area? Is that really a problem or a perception of Miami?
I think it's probably more of a perception, but I do think we have both. We have I know many people that were born and raised in Miami, and I think it's really, for lack of a better term, it is really a melting pot. One of the things, I grew up in Syracuse, New York. My grandfather was a University of Miami graduate, which is why I ended up here at the age of 18. But it really is a melting pot. One of the things, I actually left after I graduated and moved to New York with another melting pot. But one of the things that drew me back was the mix of cultures, the mix of people who literally, it's their first day here. They've just moved here, and people who have lived here, their parents have lived here, born and raised here, all different cultures, all different backgrounds, all different religions, food, languages. So I mean, I see both. As a, someone who works for the local government, we have a very strong resident community, again, that has a real emotional attachment. I think when you see that emotional attachment, there are some real roots here. There are residents that invest so much of their time because they care. They care about their neighborhoods. And I tell you, we see that just as much as you would see in New York, or any other place from my experience.
Right. Brian Harrison reminds us historic preservation is always an emotional subject. Just listen to historic preservation board meetings. I know, Deborah, you've probably been in a few of those. Susanna, I have one question for you, and then I think we'll take our final question of the evening. Thank you for everyone for the really spirited discussion in the Q&A tab there. I've loved learning a little bit about the particulars of what's going on in Miami Beach, and how all of you feel about it, which is fantastic. There's a comment here from Doug Whitnable. Hi, Doug, who says, it seems that the city will evolve into maybe a new architecture that's rooted and elevated, naturally ventilated, and allowing for water landscape to define the new dimensions of the city. Susanna, is that something that resonates with you? Do you think that, we're going to see an urbanscape more visibly shaped by water and by being on the coastline? Is that something that we should aspire to in cities that, sometimes have been built in spite of, or almost as a way of keeping water at bay? Is that an idea that resonates with you at all?
Well, I think we need to figure out a better way to live with water, and more sort of ways to harmonize. No, we need to synchronize. We need to think about sort of the natural flows and how those ecological flows and those natural flows can sync with kind of human uses of the spaces. So human occupation and human pleasure also. I take so much pleasure in walking in a city, and I've been living in Denver, and I'm feeling lost because I've lost my ability to walk in the city, because it's not a walking city at this point. Hopefully that will change. But Miami Beach is a walking place, and New York is a walking place. And I think the best urban conditions are places where you can walk. And, that may end up being on boardwalks. I don't know. I mean, but somehow we have to sort of think more holistically about our relationship to the natural environment and when we are designing our new cities or when we're retrofitting our cities. And so, when we did the 4th regional plan, I'll go back to that for a second, just, we were sort of projecting what the coastline would be in 50 years and then planning for these kind of future waterfront zones. But some of it was elevated and some of it's, it was a different way of living on the water. So ultimately, I think that's going to have to become more central to our thinking in the future.
Right. I was going to go to my last question, but Adam Bro just put in a question here that I'd love to get Alan react to really quickly. Okay. He says, because you did mention this, Alan, in your comments, about what can we do with ground level, and you said one of the options was to find other uses for that ground level. Alan says, what opportunities do you envision for the ground level, perhaps a sacrificial level of tomorrow's Miami Beach? Will the financial risks of operating a business at ground level cause a shakeup of the pedestrian realm? What might overtake these spaces? Will streetlights suffer, or will they continue to be in the realm of traditional retail? So let's just talk about that place where buildings meet the ground, and then we'll go to our last question of the evening.
First of all, hello, Adam. I don't think that there should be a sacrificial layer, because I think, one of the things that makes a great city work is that things are occupied and enlivened by many different activities and many different opportunities at the ground level. So now it could be that we consider it's sacrificial for the purpose of calculating, how many apartments could be in a building or something like that. But I think those areas should have uses, and I don't think they have to be commercial. I think they could be uses that would accept water. They could be amenities for the building that don't always have to be dry. They could be open air. And if they are enclosed, they could be uses that can adapt very quickly to rising waters. And I think a lot of work has been done on those type of spaces. So we could technically, for instance, use finishes and materials that would not be harmed or become dangerous after a big storm surge or after a king tide. Or we could do what is often done in Miami Beach, which is to flood-proof those areas and just say, okay, water is an issue. By the way, Lincoln Road, which is our commercial centerpiece of South Beach, for instance, most of those shops are flood-proofed. If a flood happens, there are floodgates that come into play and that begin to keep out the water. And I think that could be a strategy in these buildings. But the most important thing is to keep the buildings and the floors occupied, I think, in one way or another.
Right, absolutely. Susanna also put in vertical farms and agriculture as options for ground level use into chat.
I put that in because I had we did the Milan Expo and worked with this guy named Nate Story, who has a company called Bright Agrotech, and they create these vertical farms using this zip grow system. And one of his big clients is actually a bar owner in Miami because they needed the vertical farms in order to grow mint for mojitos. So I was thinking, oh, there's a use.
So before we close out today, first of all, thank you for everyone for sticking out with us through this really incredible conversation. Thanks again to our sponsors, Grohe, Durkin, and Material Bank for supporting today's discussion. Thanks also, of course, to Schulman and Associates for bringing us all together and for hosting this conversation. I truly appreciate it, Alan. Also to note, please, everybody, look out for the release of Buoyant City Historic District Resiliency and Adaptation Guidelines, which was completed earlier this year, is up for approval soon, and I think should be available for all of you to look at and consult, hopefully pretty soon. So keep an eye out for that. Obviously, when it comes out, we'd love to, we will try and pass word out at Metropolis as well, so we'll keep you informed. My last question, this year, I think the word in 2020, the worst year, I think, in recent memory, the word resilience has become really kind of important. It's taken on this additional resonance with, the COVID-19 crisis. We've started to understand it not just in ecological terms, but in economic terms and social terms, and also in terms of health. And so I'd just love to hear, as closing thoughts, how you are thinking about resilience this year. Have you started to think about it in new ways, either in your work or elsewhere? Just some closing thoughts on that would be great.
So I have been thinking about this a lot, and the way I've started to view resilience is not the ability to dodge a hit, but the ability to take a hit and recover. Because I don't think we can avoid getting knocked down anymore, and I think that we're probably going to get knocked down harder and more often. So for me, when I start thinking about resiliency in design and in health, it's how quick can you recover after the hit? And I think that's what we're all planning for. And it's the same with sea level rise. We can't keep the water out completely, but how quick can we get back to business? Can life go on during the water event or after the water event? So that's kind of what has changed my thinking of this. not necessarily avoidance of an issue, but recovery and how we can plan for that.
Alan, do you want me to go so you can close?
Sure.
I don't know. You should close.
Yes, please.
It's your show, right? So I guess from my perspective, I'm concerned that we need to maintain momentum around urban design and not sort of lose our love for cities and urbanity, because we're going to have urbanity in order to save the natural landscape. So that's one. I think the COVID crisis has raised an awareness of the importance of public open space, and I think it's enabling a lot of new opportunity to happen in realms where it might not have been quite as popular in the past. So of necessity, we're having to take over the streets, for instance. And then I think it also, finally, really has raised so much awareness about the importance of community and how important that is to us as humans, and how isolating it can be when we don't have that. So, and I think that has raised awareness of some of the patterns that we've created, particularly in the post-war period, that have enabled a lot of isolation. So, I think that there are a lot of opportunities within those categories that I just listed, and I'm optimistic that we can use this as a lesson to design better in the future.
Yeah, I just want to, follow on that same idea, because I've been thinking a lot about cities and was initially quite depressed about, people getting back in their cars, forsaking public transportation, abandoning cities and moving to houses. And it seemed like COVID was pushing us in this direction of isolation, exactly as Susanna's proposing. And I think I want to make sure that we're not taking the wrong lessons from COVID. Like, there are many things we're learning, interesting new techniques, and I see it in many different ways. But I think I agree with that notion that community is more than ever important, and that cities are an embodiment of community and an embodiment of our ability to, thrive off of each other, and for people to find that super interesting. People come to Miami Beach because it's a city and because it's clear that there's a lot going on. You engage the urban life there. That's so we don't want to lose that, and I think that is going to be a challenge of designers to think about how we don't take the wrong lessons, how we adapt urban living for pandemics, for flooding, for all of that. So this is one piece of that, but there are so many other pieces. Obviously, resiliency is a very broad topic. I was mentioning earlier, I think it has to do with a lot of things: the economics, our social interactions, etc. So we should move on all fronts.
Right. Well, thank you all so much for all the insights you've shared today. I'll tell you, I think one of the primary things I'm taking away from this discussion is really a sense of optimism in the face of crisis. I think all of you have really underlined that, talking about beauty, Deborah, I just loved hearing about that from you, just, hanging on to that notion of that our cities need to be beautiful. I loved hearing from both Alan and Susanna about, really pragmatic, but clearly optimistic views of, how we can adapt, how we can change, and really being accepting and open of the new conditions that are going to arise. Trying to really safeguard, Alan, you just spoke about community, trying to really safeguard that heartbeat of our cities, that sense of connection we feel with each other, while also understanding that some changes will have to be made, and we have to make them as sensitively as possible. I am looking forward to the release of Point City. I'm sure many in the audience today are too. It is an incredible document. And thank you so much for all the work you do, all three of you. It's been a real pleasure talking to you today. Thank you also to everyone who's joined us today. It's been incredible seeing the passion and the engagement with which you've participate in today's discussion. I've loved seeing all the comments and the suggestions and the conversations really in the Q&A tab today. It's clear that this is something that we all feel emotionally and existentially, and that's really important. That's what's going to drive all of us forward to a better built environment and a better natural environment. So thank you so much for that. I truly, truly, truly appreciate it. Thanks one last time to our sponsors, Grohe and Durkin and Material Bank, for supporting today's discussion and making it possible. A reminder again to what Tina said at the start of this discussion. Today's session is being recorded. It will be played on DesignTV by SANDOW, so it will run on Metropolis's Facebook page, Interior Design's Facebook page, as well as both our home pages next Thursday. And it will also then be available on the following day on demand on our website, metropolismag.com, at our think tank page. So that's metropolismag.com/think tank. Pretty easy to remember. So by next Friday, you should be able to see this session on demand, but it will be broadcast on DesignTV next Thursday. Thanks again to everyone for joining us today. I've learned so much during today's discussion. I hope you have too. Have a great evening, and I hope all of you continue doing the great work that you do. Thank you.